Hello biology students, Mr. Yonker here, and this is just a beginning set of video notes for our genetics unit. Genetics is an amazing and awesome topic. It's the study of how we get the traits that we have, traits like hair color, eye color, disease, anything that we have that we've inherited from our parents is part of the study of genetics. Genetics influences how these traits are passed from one person to another. The first term that we're going to look at in this set of notes, and really the whole topic of genetics has lots of terms, and all the important terms are going to be highlighted for you in red. You might want to write these down or even take overall notes as you watch this video. But the first term is recessive, and so we look at recessive traits, and those are the traits that are masked or covered up by a dominant gene. And so if there's a dominant gene present, they're not expressed. An example of a recessive trait is hitchhiker's thumb, and you can look at your own thumb and see if you have this trait or not. If you can bend your thumb back like this person can, 90 degrees, you have hitchhiker's thumb. Another recessive trait is attached earlobes, and you can see pretty clearly on the one on the left that the earlobe is attached right to the side of the face. And if you don't have attached earlobes, you've got a part that hangs down, kind of dangles down just like that. A second important term that we use in genetics is called dominant. And so we're looking at dominant traits and recessive traits in these notes. And a dominant trait is where the trait masks or covers up other traits. The first example of a dominant trait is widow's peak, and you can see it pretty clearly here on Eddie Munster. Don't know if you guys have watched the Munsters, but the widow's peak is just the front of your hair coming right down on your forehead, just like a little point. A second dominant trait that we're going to look at is the trait for tongue rolling, and obviously you know if you can do it or not. You can see this person way to the right is able to roll their tongue in a nice tight circle, and the person on the left does an amazing job of rolling their tongue like a clover leaf. Brown eyes is another example of a dominant trait. This person here on the left, clearly brown eyes, and blue eyes, which is what I have, is a recessive trait. If you're able to clasp your hands together and you find out that your left thumb is on top, you have the trait thumb crossing. You know you have that trait as well if it's just really uncomfortable for your right thumb to be on top of the left thumb. In this first set of notes, we're looking at some pretty basic types of inheritance, what we call dominant and recessive inheritance patterns. But there's more complicated ones as well, and one of those is sex-linked traits. These are traits that are carried on our sex chromosomes, which are the X and the Y chromosomes. And we'll look more at traits like this in a future video in our next unit. An example of an X-linked or sex-linked trait is color blindness. And if you can see the letter 26 in this circle, you don't have color blindness. If you can't see it, you do. And most people can see it, but it's right here. We have a couple more terms that you need to know to understand genetics. One term on this slide is a familiar one to you, hopefully, because we talked about it in our DNA, RNA, and protein synthesis unit, and that is what a gene is. It's a segment of DNA that actually codes for the specific trait that you have. And genes always come in two forms. Those forms are called alleles, and the reason they come in two forms is you get one from your mom and one from your dad. Scientists use letters to represent alleles, and so we will use capital letters to refer to dominant alleles. And again, an allele is just a gene. We're using those terms synonymously. Lowercase letters always refer to recessive alleles. For example, the allele for the dominant trait of rolling your tongue is represented by a capital T, and the recessive trait, not being able to roll your tongue, is represented by a lowercase t. So continuing with the example of tongue rolling, if you're able to roll your tongue, your alleles or genes would be either big T or big T, little t. In other words, every time you have a big T, and that big T could come either from mom or dad, you're going to be able to roll your tongue because you have at least one of the dominant alleles or genes. Now, the people that have two recessive alleles, or little t, are those that will show the recessive form of the trait, meaning they cannot roll their tongue. We're going to do a little practice here writing down the allele combinations for the following traits. So if you're able to roll your tongue, what allele combinations or letters would you write down for this dominant trait? You would either have, and obviously you can't write them down, but just think about them. Well, you could write them down if you have a piece of note paper. If you can roll your tongue, you would either be a big T, or a big T, little t. Now for the dominant trait of thumb crossing, where your left thumb lands on top when you fold your hands, we're using the letter L as the expression or representation of that gene or allele. What letters would you write down? What allele combinations could you have? So think about that, or write it down on a piece of paper. You would have either a big L, or a big L, little l, because remember, every time you have at least one big L, it will show or express the dominant trait. Finally, for the trait blue eyes, we're going to use the letter B to represent this trait, this allele. This is a recessive trait. What letters would you write down? Well, you would put down little b, and that's all you can put down. You must have gotten one of the little b's from mom and one of the little b's from dad. If you wrote down big B, little b, you'd have brown eyes, because brown eyes is a dominant trait, and anytime you have a big B, remember the capital letters represent the dominant traits, that would mask the little b. So you would have brown eyes. We have a few more terms on this slide, and again, important terms to really get the basics of genetics. The first one is the genetic makeup of an organism, and so we're talking about the actual genes, or again, we use the term alleles synonymously, of an organism, and the genetic makeup of an organism is called its genotype. And that's kind of easy to remember because it has the same 3 letters as gene. The second term is what we call the appearance of an organism. And the appearance of the organism is referred to as its phenotype. And one of the ways I remember it is because phenotype is pH, and pH also are the 2 letters that are the start of the word physical. And so think of your physical features, your body size, your hair, your eyes, eye color, etc. Those are all the expression of the genotype, and that's what your appearance is. It's the physical features that you have. And so the words are different because the genotype and the phenotype of an organism can be different. Here's an example of how the genotype and phenotype can be different. We may have the trait brown eyes. That's our phenotype. Remember, that's the physical expression of the gene. It's how we appear, what we can see. But the genes that cause that can be different because you could have a big B, or a big B, little b, and still have brown eyes. Whereas if you have blue eyes, the only genotype that you could have is little b, little b.